The request was not a request. It was a command, delivered with the casual tyranny of someone who had never been told no. "I want that table." Every syllable was coated in diamonds and disdain. The words sliced through the hushed elegance of Aurelia, the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan, and all eyes swiveled to the source. Mrs. Beatrice Sterling, a woman sculpted from money and malice, pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward the corner. Her target was a small, quiet woman, sitting alone at table 12, the restaurant's most coveted seat. The woman wore a simple tweed jacket and sensible shoes. Her hair was a neat silver bun, her face etched with the fine lines of a life lived thoughtfully. She looked like a retired librarian, an unassuming ghost at the feast, utterly invisible until Beatrice Sterling's ambition made her the center of the universe. In that instant, a young waitress named Maya Washington felt a cold dread snake up her spine. She saw the storm gathering, the inevitable collision of unchecked entitlement and quiet dignity. Phones began to lift subtly from linen-draped tables, the modern ritual of sensing blood in the water. Mrs. Sterling's lips curled into a smirk of absolute certainty. The maître d', Antoine, was already gliding toward her, his face a mask of obsequious apology, ready to sacrifice the old woman for the comfort of his wealthiest patron. But what none of them knew, what only the reader knows, is that the woman they were about to trample was not a ghost. She was the foundation upon which Aurelia was built. She was the silent queen who had come to inspect her crumbling kingdom, and the people who were about to show her such profound disrespect had no idea they were personally orchestrating their own spectacular ruin. Eleanor Vance, known in the rarefied world of global gastronomy only by her initials, EV, was less a person and more a legend. She was the ghost investor, the culinary kingmaker. When a restaurant with a soul but failing finances was on the brink of collapse, a quiet offer would appear from an anonymous trust. If accepted, EV would descend, dissecting every aspect of the operation from the supply chain to the sommelier's diction, and with surgical precision, she would either restore it to glory or bury it. Her portfolio was a litany of 3-star Michelin temples, and her name, whispered in back kitchens from Paris to Tokyo, was a synonym for terrifying, infallible judgment. But tonight, at Aurelia, she was Mrs. Peterson, a retired history professor from Ohio on a solo trip to the city. Her disguise was flawless in its simplicity. The slightly worn handbag, the spectacles perched on her nose, the paperback novel resting beside her water glass. It all screamed pleasant, harmless, and most importantly, insignificant. The only hint of her true stature was the watch on her wrist, a vintage Patek Philippe Calatrava, a gift from her late mentor. But its design was so understated, so elegantly discreet, it was easily mistaken for a sentimental heirloom of little value. This visit was not business. It was a pilgrimage, and a painful one. Aurelia was the magnum opus of Chef Julian Croft, Eleanor's mentor, the man who had found her as a ferociously intelligent but penniless culinary student and forged her into the force she was today. Julian had built Aurelia on a simple, radical principle. The plate is the only status that matters. He had treated every guest, from a construction worker celebrating an anniversary to a head of state, with the same reverence. But Julian was gone, taken by a sudden illness a year ago, and his beloved restaurant had been left in the hands of a board of investors who understood balance sheets, but not the delicate alchemy of a dining room. The reports that crossed Eleanor's desk were heartbreaking. Customer satisfaction was in free fall. Reviews spoke of a new, toxic culture, A place that once celebrated artistry now worshipped wealth. Staff turnover was astronomical. The soul of Aurelia was bleeding out. Julian's legacy was being tarnished by the very people entrusted to protect it. So Eleanor had come, not as E.V. the Titan, but as Mrs. Peterson the Nobody, to see the sickness for herself. Her evening had already been a case study in decline. The hostess had greeted her with a barely concealed sigh, her eyes flicking over Eleanor's sensible coat with dismissive speed. The busboy had filled her water glass with a sloppiness that would have given Julian an aneurysm, leaving a small puddle on the pristine linen. And now she was watching the maître d'armes, a man named Antoine Dubois, fawn over Beatrice Sterling. He was the picture of continental charm, but his eyes were cold, calculating instruments that measured guests by their net worth. He was precisely the kind of sycophant Julian had despised. Eleanor made a small note on a napkin, a habit she'd never broken. Maître d' prioritizes spectacle over service, posture of a peacock, soul of a vulture, source of the rot. Across the room, Maya Washington was trying to keep her breathing even. At 20, she was the youngest server at Aurelia, a scholarship student at the Culinary Institute of America, working grueling hours to pay for her books and lodgings. For her, Aurelia wasn't just a job. It was supposed to be the temple. She had studied Julian Croft's menus, memorized his philosophies. Working here was like an art history student getting a job at the Louvre. But the reality had been a brutal disappointment. The kitchen was still brilliant, a testament to the brigade Julian had trained, but the front of house, under Antoine's command, was a viper pit of ego and greed. Maya had been assigned the corner section, including the hallowed table 12. It was a table Antoine usually reserved for his biggest tippers, but tonight a last-minute cancellation had opened it up, and the unassuming Mrs. Peterson had been the next reservation in line. Maya had been delighted. The old woman was a breath of fresh air. She had asked intelligent questions about the wine pairings, her eyes lighting up when Maya described the chef's new crudo preparation. She was a guest who was actually there for the food, a rare creature in the new Aurelia. Now that rare creature was about to be devoured by the restaurant's most infamous predator. Beatrice Sterling was a regular, a woman whose husband, a brutish real estate developer named Robert Sterling, used Aurelia as his personal clubhouse. Beatrice treated the staff like feudal serfs. She was known for demanding last-minute menu changes, complaining about imaginary drafts to get free bottles of champagne, and writing career-ending reviews on a whim. The entire staff dreaded the sight of her name in the reservation book. "Antoine, darling," Beatrice purred, her voice loud enough for half the room to hear. "There's been a mistake. My table. That woman is sitting in it." Antoine glided over to Beatrice, bending at the waist in a maneuver of pure subservience. "Madame Sterling, 1,000 apologies. There was a mix-up in the booking system, a ghost in the machine, you understand." He shot a venomous glare across the room, not at the system, but at Maya. The message was clear. "This is your fault." "Well, fix it," Beatrice commanded, waving a dismissive hand. "I don't want to stand here like a tourist. Move her." Antoine straightened his tie, his face settling into a mask of grim determination. This was a test of his authority, a performance for his most important audience. He began his long, theatrical walk across the dining room, his polished shoes clicking on the marble floor like the countdown to an execution. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew what was coming. She was supposed to stand aside, to let him handle it, to be a silent accomplice in the humiliation of her guest. But as he approached table 12, something inside her, a stubborn spark of decency inherited from her grandmother, refused to be extinguished, She took a small, steadying breath and stepped forward, intercepting him just before he reached the table. "Antoine, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. His eyes narrowed. "I am handling a situation, Maya. A situation you created by seating a non-entity at the best table in the house. Now step aside." "She had a reservation," Maya insisted, keeping her voice low. "It's her table. Mrs. Sterling can have table 8. It has a lovely view of the park." Antoine let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Table 8? Do you have any idea who that is? The Sterlings spend more in a month than you will make in a decade. They are the reason this restaurant survives. Now for the last time, get out of my way." He brushed past her, his shoulder knocking hers with deliberate force. Eleanor, who had been watching the entire exchange with the detached curiosity of a sociologist observing tribal rituals, looked up from her novel as he arrived. Her expression was one of mild academic inquiry. "Excuse me," Antoine began, his voice a slick concoction of false sympathy and steel. "I am Antoine Dubois, the maître d'. I am so terribly sorry, but there appears to have been a slight error with our seating arrangement this evening." "Oh." Eleanor's voice was soft, gentle. "Everything seems perfectly fine to me." "Yes." "Well," Antoine continued, not accustomed to being questioned, "this particular table was reserved for another party, one of our long-standing patrons. We would be so grateful if you would allow us to move you to another, equally comfortable table." He gestured vaguely toward a less desirable table near the noisy service entrance. Eleanor's eyes followed his gesture, then returned to his face. A flicker of something, amusement perhaps, danced in their depths. "Equally comfortable? That seems unlikely. That table is in a direct service path and lacks the view of the kitchen pass. I specifically requested a quiet table with a good view when I made my reservation 3 weeks ago. This one is perfect." The mention of the kitchen pass was a small, sharp detail. It was something a true connoisseur would appreciate, the chance to watch the theatre of the chefs at work. It was the first tiny crack in Eleanor's disguise, but Antoine was too blinded by his mission to notice. "Be that as it may," he said, his patience beginning to fray. "We must insist. Madame Sterling is waiting." "Madame Sterling?" Eleanor asked, feigning confusion. "Is she the lady who believes speaking loudly is a substitute for having an interesting personality?" A nearby diner choked on his wine. Antoine's face, which was his livelihood, went rigid. The polite fiction of a mistake was evaporating, revealing the brutish power play beneath. "Ma'am!" Antoine's voice dropped, the false charm replaced by a cold threat. "I am trying to be polite. You are holding up our service. Now, if you will please gather your things." This was the moment Maya was supposed to disappear. But looking at the calm, elderly woman being bullied by this preening tyrant, she couldn't. She stepped forward again, placing herself between Antoine and the table. "Antoine, stop," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "You can't do this. It's against everything Chef Croft believed in." The invocation of the founder's name was a declaration of war. Antoine's face contorted with fury. "How dare you?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "You are a child. You will be clearing tables at a diner in Queens by tomorrow morning. You are fired." "You can't fire me for defending a guest," Maya shot back, her fear being burned away by a sudden, liberating anger. "Watch me," he snarled. Beatrice Sterling, seeing the stalemate, began her own regal procession across the room. She arrived at the table like a hurricane of Chanel No. 5. "What is the problem here?" she demanded, looking down her nose at Eleanor. "Did you not hear the man? Get up. You're in my seat." Eleanor looked from Beatrice's furious face to Antoine's, then to the young, defiant waitress standing guard. She had seen enough. The rot was not just present, it was malignant. It had already consumed the front of house and was now threatening to devour the last remnants of decency on the floor. She slowly folded the corner of the page in her book, placed it on the table, and gave Beatrice Sterling her full, undivided attention. "I have heard him," Eleanor said, her voice still quiet but now resonating with an unnerving authority. "I have also heard you, and the answer is no." The simple, two-letter word fell into the silent dining room with the force of a guillotine. Beatrice Sterling's jaw actually dropped. She was a woman who moved through the world on a cushion of yes. A no was not just a refusal, it was an existential affront. What did you say to me?" she sputtered, her face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "I believe my words were clear," Eleanor replied, her gaze unwavering. "This is my table. I will not be moving." This young woman, she gestured to Maya, was correct to defend the integrity of the reservation system. And you, sir, she turned to Antoine, have just illegally terminated an employee in the middle of the dining room for upholding company policy. It's quite a spectacle. Antoine was momentarily stunned by this articulate surgical takedown from a woman he had dismissed as a doddering old fool. But Beatrice's rage quickly filled the vacuum. "A spectacle? I'll give you a spectacle," she shrieked, her voice echoing through the cavernous room. "Antoine, call security. Have this vagrant removed. She's trespassing." "I am not asking you any more, ma'am," Antoine said, recovering his footing and seizing on Beatrice's command. He saw his career, his enormous tips, his entire parasitic ecosystem flashing before his eyes. He had to win this. "I am instructing you to leave this table. If you refuse, we will have you escorted from the premises." "On what grounds?" Eleanor asked, her tone one of genuine curiosity. "On the grounds that you are creating a disturbance." "I'm sitting quietly, reading a book," Eleanor countered. "You and this woman are the ones shouting. The disturbance, it seems, is you." This was it. The final humiliation. To be outmaneuvered, out-argued, and defied by this nobody. Antoine made the final, fatal error. He reached down and placed his hand on Eleanor's book, as if to sweep it off the table. "That's enough," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "Get out, now. We'll even be generous. We will not charge you for your water." The insult was so petty, so profoundly condescending, that it was almost comical. It was the Aurelia equivalent of being told to move to the back of the bus. Eleanor looked at his hand on her book. She looked at Beatrice's triumphant smirk. She looked at Maya's terrified but resolute face. Then she slowly, deliberately, reached into her worn handbag. Antoine and Beatrice tensed, perhaps expecting a phone to record them. Instead, she pulled out a simple, elegant leather card holder. "I don't think security will be necessary, Antoine," she said, her voice undergoing a startling transformation. The gentle professorial tone was gone, replaced by something cold, sharp, and absolutely commanding. "But you are right. It is time to involve management and the ownership." She flipped open the card holder and slid a single, heavy-stock business card onto the table. It was cream-colored, with a simple embossed letter V in the center. Nothing else. Antoine glanced at it. "What is this? Are you a blogger? We don't accept reviews from—" He trailed off as a man in a sharp suit hurried toward their table, his face pale with anxiety. It was David Chen, the general manager, a man who usually remained in his office, insulated from the floor. "What in God's name is going on out here?" David demanded. his eyes darting between the furious patrons and his maître d'. "Antoine, I have the board chairman on the phone. He's patched in through the restaurant's security feed. He wants to know why you're harassing a guest." Antoine froze. "The board chairman? Watching?" "Sir, this woman. She was causing a scene, refusing to move for Madame Sterling." "Is this the guest?" David asked, his eyes falling on Eleanor. He looked at her, at the tweed jacket, the sensible shoes, and then at the single, elegant card on the table. His blood ran cold. He had only seen that card once before, in a file marked "Ownership Strictly Confidential." It was the calling card of E.V. David's face. A moment ago, a mask of professional annoyance collapsed into a canvas of pure, unadulterated terror. He felt the floor drop out from beneath him. "Oh my God," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "Mrs. Vance, I am so sorry. I had no idea." The name hit the air like a thunderclap. Vance. As in, E.V. Beatrice Sterling looked confused, but Antoine, who trafficked in the gossip of the hospitality world, felt a sudden, sickening wave of comprehension. He looked from the card to the woman's face, truly seeing her for the first time. The intelligent, assessing eyes, the posture of unshakable confidence. It couldn't be. "Vance!" Beatrice scoffed, still oblivious. "I don't care if her name is Vanderbilt. She is leaving my table." "Madame Sterling," David Chen said, his voice shaking but firm, finding a spine he didn't know he possessed. "That is not your table. In fact, nothing in this restaurant is yours. You are speaking to Eleanor Vance. She owns this restaurant." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a world ending. Every diner, every staff member was frozen, staring at the unassuming woman in the corner. The retired librarian was gone. In her place sat a queen on her throne, her expression one of profound, glacial disappointment. Antoine Dubois looked as though he had been turned to stone. His face was a waxy, bloodless mask. He stared at Eleanor, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. Eleanor finally stood up. She was not a tall woman, but in that moment she commanded the space with an imperial gravity that made everyone else seem small. Her gaze, sharp and analytical, swept over the room before landing, with crushing weight on Antoine. "Mr. Dubois," she began, her voice resonating with the quiet power of a judge delivering a verdict. "For the past year, I have been reading reports about the decay of this establishment. I read about a culture of arrogance, of prejudice, of service being contingent on a guest's perceived wealth. I had hoped they were exaggerations. You, sir, have shown me they were understatements." She picked up the napkin with her scribbled note. "I observed you from the moment I arrived. You ignored guests you deemed unimportant. You instructed your staff to prioritize tips over standards. And just now, you attempted to eject a paying customer to appease the ego of a bully. You then summarily and illegally fired a junior employee for demonstrating more integrity and knowledge of Julian Croft's principles than you have ever possessed. You are not a maître d'. You are a disease." Antoine swayed, grabbing the back of a chair for support. I was only trying to accommodate our best." "Your best customer?" Eleanor's voice was laced with ice. She turned her formidable gaze to Beatrice Sterling, who had shrunk back, her face a mixture of fury and a dawning, horrifying understanding. "And you, Mrs. Sterling," Eleanor continued, "you believe your husband's money buys you the right to treat people as furniture. You believe your patronage makes you royalty. Let me be perfectly clear. You are not royalty. You are simply a vulgar woman who has mistaken rudeness for power." You are the living embodiment of everything Julian despised, and you have been a corrosive presence in his house for far too long. Now you wait just a minute. Beatrice finally found her voice, though it was thin and reedy. My husband, Robert Sterling, is one of this city's most important men. He will hear about this. He will ruin you. Eleanor allowed a small, cold smile to touch her lips. Ruin me? Madam, your husband develops buildings. I build and dismantle empires. As of this moment, your permanent reservation at Aurelia is cancelled. Your name is being placed on a city-wide list of problematic patrons that I share with every other fine dining establishment of note. By the time you get home, your name will be poison from Percé to Le Bernardin. You will find the welcome at Appleby's to be more your speed from now on. Now get out of my restaurant. The finality of the command was absolute. Richard Sterling's name, the cudgel she had used to terrorize people for years, had been rendered useless. Beatrice stood there, exposed and powerless, the target of dozens of phone cameras. Her husband, who had been watching the scene unfold from the bar, finally rushed over. "What the hell is this?" he blustered, a big man used to physical intimidation. "Who do you think you are?" David Chen, the GM, stepped forward. "Mr. Sterling, this is Eleanor Vance. She is the majority shareholder of the trust that owns this restaurant. I suggest you and your wife leave quietly." Robert Sterling, a man who understood power dynamics better than anyone, looked at Eleanor's calm, unyielding face, at the terrified faces of his fellow one-percenters, and knew instantly that this was a battle he could not win. He grabbed his wife's arm. "Beatrice, let's go, now." Humiliated, defeated, Beatrice Sterling was led from the restaurant, her reign of terror over. The dining room erupted in a low murmur, a mixture of shock and exhilaration. Eleanor turned her attention back to the wreckage. Her eyes found Maya, who was standing by the service station, looking pale but resolute. "Young lady," Eleanor said, her voice softening slightly. "What is your name?" "Maya Washington, ma'am." "Maya Washington," Eleanor repeated, as if committing it to memory. "You have a deep knowledge of this restaurant's philosophy and the courage to defend it. You were willing to sacrifice your job for a principle. That is a quality I find exceedingly rare. You are not fired. In fact, I believe we need to discuss your future." She then looked at the trembling wreck that was Antoine Dubois. "Mr. Dubois, collect your personal effects. Mr. Chen will have your final paycheck and a severance agreement drawn up. The agreement will include a non-disclosure clause of formidable scope and penalty. If I ever hear your name associated with the fine dining industry again, I will assume you have violated it. Security will escort you from the premises." With a final, broken whimper, Antoine shuffled away, his career in ashes, a ghost exorcised from the house he had haunted. Eleanor Vance stood for a moment in the center of the dining room, her dining room. She looked at the stunned faces of the staff, the awed faces of the guests. The initial, explosive part of the cleansing was over, but the real work, the slow, methodical process of rebuilding Julian's legacy from the ground up, had only just begun. The hours following the public execution of Antoine's career were a masterclass in controlled chaos. As the Sterlings were ejected and Antoine was escorted out a back entrance, a pariah in the world he had so desperately tried to conquer, Eleanor Vance did not retreat. She took command. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the stunned silence of the dining room. "Please go to every table. Apologize for the disturbance. Inform them that for the inconvenience, their wine this evening is on the house. No, not the house. It is on me, personally." It was a gesture of immense class, instantly transforming a moment of ugly drama into an event of shared legendary status. The guests, who had just witnessed the fall of a tyrant and the humiliation of a socialite, were now part owners of the story. David Chen, his face a mask of awe and relief, nodded and immediately set about his task, his steps lighter than they had been in months. Eleanor then turned to the assembled waitstaff, who were huddled near the kitchen doors like frightened sheep. "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said simply. "As of tonight, I am taking direct operational control of Aurelia. Everything you were taught by Mr. Dubois about prioritizing certain guests is over. Your only priority is the plate and the person in front of you, regardless of who they are. Chef Croft's standards are back in effect. If this is not the last word of her judgment, welcome hung in the air, a benediction and a challenge. A collective exhalation, soft as a prayer, swept through the ranks of the staff. It was the sound of a held breath released after a year of suffocation. Carlos, a waiter whose stooped shoulders seemed to have been molded by Antoine's reign, straightened up, a decade of weariness falling away from him. His eyes, dark and kind, were glistening. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance," he managed, his voice a low, reverent rumble that carried the weight of 100 unspoken frustrations. Eleanor offered him a nod that was both an acknowledgement and a promise. Her gaze then swept past the other faces, some relieved, some still wary, all irrevocably changed, and settled on Maya, who stood frozen by table 12, an island of stillness in a sea of swirling emotion. She looked like a soldier who, having inexplicably survived the battle, was unsure what to do with the sudden, deafening peace. "Maya," Eleanor's voice was softer now, the steel sheathed, the warmth of a master artisan returning to her workshop. "Please, join me." She gestured to the chair opposite her, the one Beatrice Sterling had coveted with such self-destructive avarice. As if in a dream, Maya moved, her limbs feeling disconnected from her mind. She sank into the plush leather, her server's apron a stark contrast to the opulent setting she now occupied as a guest. The murmur of the dining room began to rise again. But it was different now. The tense, gossipy whispers had been replaced by a low, excited buzz, the energy of a story being born. They were no longer diners. They were witnesses. Eleanor watched the young woman across from her, truly seeing her for the first time without the filter of her Mrs. Peterson disguise. She saw the exhaustion shadowing her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands now resting in her lap. But beneath it all, she saw a spine forged from something unbuyable. She saw the flickering pilot light of a formidable spirit. "I understand you are a student at the Culinary Institute of America," Eleanor began, her tone shifting from commander to mentor. It was a statement, not a question. She had already requested Maya's file from David Chen with a single, discreet gesture. "Yes, ma'am." Maya's voice was barely a whisper. "Second year. I was focusing on pastry." She winced, the past tense, a reflexive remnant of a career she thought had ended 20 minutes ago. "You are focusing on pastry," Eleanor corrected gently. "But your interests are broader. When you intercepted Mr. Dubois, you mentioned Chef Croft's principles. And earlier, when you took my order, you spoke of the kitchen pass. You described the new crudo not just by its ingredients, but by its philosophy, how it honored Julian's belief in letting the sea speak for itself." "Why?" Maya took a deep breath, the question grounding her, pulling her back from the precipice of shock. "His books," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its earlier conviction. "I've read them all. The Humble Onion, Service as a sacrament. I have notes in the margins of my notes. He wrote that a reservation isn't a transaction, it's a promise of care, of respect, of a moment of peace in a chaotic world. To break that promise for a higher bidder. She trailed off, searching for the right words. It's more than just bad business. It's a form of theft. You're stealing the trust someone placed in you. Eleanor felt a profound sense of recognition, a resonance that echoed across the decades to a time when she was the hungry, ferociously idealistic student and Julian was the master. He had seen the same fire in her. "Food is memory, Eleanor," he used to say, his large hands shaping dough with impossible gentleness. "But service is the soul. Without it, we are just merchants." "He would have been immensely proud of you tonight," Eleanor said, the words carrying a deep personal weight. "And he would have been incandescent with rage that you were forced to be his only defender." She leaned forward, her gaze intense, her hands resting on the table as if it were a map of the future she was about to draw. This place, this beautiful, wounded place, has been poisoned. The antidote isn't just a new maitre d' or a revised mission statement. It requires a complete transfusion of its blood, its spirit. I am here to do that. But I am not a magician. I am a builder, and a builder needs a cornerstone. I need people who don't just work here, but who understand here. She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting Maya feel the gravity of the moment. Your scholarship to the CIA. Consider it paid in full, effective immediately, an anonymous grant from the Vance Foundation. Furthermore, I am offering you a position. Not as a waitress, but as my apprentice. You will continue to work here, but you will walk every inch of this restaurant's life. You will spend mornings with the fishmongers and afternoons with the accountants. You will learn how the sommeliers of Bordeaux negotiate their futures and how a single line item for saffron can ripple through a quarterly report. You will shadow David Chen as he learns to lead without fear, and you will work beside the new executive chef I intend to hire. I will not teach you how to run a restaurant, Maya. I will teach you how to build, protect, and propagate a legacy. I will teach you how to command an empire. The world tilted on its axis for Maya Washington. An hour ago, her greatest ambition was to survive her shift, to pay her rent, to maybe, one day, perfect a quignon that didn't burn. Now, the architect of the modern culinary world was offering her a key to the kingdom. Tears, hot and overwhelming, welled in her eyes and traced silent paths down her cheeks. They weren't tears of relief or shock, but of a profound, shattering gratitude for a future she had never, in her wildest dreams, dared to imagine. I don't know what to say, she stammered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. There are only two words that matter right now, Eleanor said, a rare, genuine smile gracing her lips. The first is yes, the second is when. Yes, Maya breathed, the word a release, a commitment, a beginning. When do I start? The following morning, Eleanor arrived at Aurelia before the sun had fully risen, letting herself in through a service entrance with a key she hadn't used in over a year. The dining room was dark and silent, haunted by the ghosts of last night's drama. The air was thick with the scent of stale wine, beeswax, and something else, the metallic tang of fear and the faint, sweet perfume of hope. She walked to table 12 and stood there, looking out over the empty chairs and pristine white cloths. This was not a conquest, it was a reclamation, a salvage operation. Julian's presence was a palpable weight in the room. She could almost see him, a bear of a man with flour dusting his eyebrows, surveying his domain with a look of fierce, paternal love. "Look at the mess they've made of our house, Julian," she thought, a familiar ache tightening her chest. The victory over the Sterlings and Antoine felt hollow in the face of the deeper desecration. It was like repainting a single room in a cathedral that had been allowed to fall into ruin. Her first calls were made from Julian's old office, a small, cramped room she had insisted the board leave untouched. It still smelled faintly of his cigarillos and espresso. The calls were brief, precise, and devastating. The first was to her chief counsel. The severance package for Antoine Dubois was to be drafted immediately. It was generous enough to ensure he signed it without protest, but the non-disclosure and non-compete clauses were masterpieces of legal strangulation. He would be forbidden from working in any Michelin-starred or equivalent fine dining establishment in North America or Western Europe for a period of 10 years. He would be erased from the world he worshipped. A quiet word to a handful of influential headhunters would ensure the blacklist was absolute. Eleanor felt no pleasure in it, only a grim necessity. You do not reason with a cancer. You excise it completely. The second matter was the Sterlings. Robert Sterling's inevitable legal threat arrived via email before 9 a.m. It was a blustering, pompous document filled with accusations of defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Eleanor read it once, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. Amateurs. They thought the battlefield was a courtroom. Her response was not a legal letter. It was a digital package delivered by a secure courier to Robert Sterling's personal office. It contained 3 items. The first was the video file, a seamless edit of security footage and diner cell phone clips, professionally sound mixed to capture every shrill, entitled syllable his wife had uttered. The second was a simple document, a list of the private email addresses for every major society columnist in the city, the editors of Eater and the New York Times food section, and 3 notoriously vicious gossip bloggers. The third item was a meticulously compiled log of Mr. Sterling's own reservations at Aurelia for the past 12 months. Dates, times, and table numbers were cross-referenced with credit card receipts showing dinners for 2, paid for on his corporate account. On evenings, his wife's social calendar showed her to be at charity galas across town. A single handwritten note accompanied the package. "Mr. Sterling, you mistake the arena. This is not a battle of laws, it is a battle of narratives. Yours is short, ugly, and incriminating. Mine is long, detailed, and has a much wider audience. The choice of which story gets told is entirely yours." E.V. The lawsuit was withdrawn by 10:30 a.m. The Sterlings would not be ruined financially, which was a clumsy, brutish form of destruction. Instead, they would be rendered irrelevant, their social currency incinerated. They would become a punchline, a cautionary tale told over champagne at the very parties they could no longer attend. It was a far more elegant and permanent demise. Her final piece of business was the most critical. She called an emergency meeting of the Aurelia board. They convened that afternoon in their sterile, mahogany-clad boardroom, a place that reeked of money and moral compromise. The 5 men, led by Chairman Arthur Hemmings, regarded her with a mixture of apprehension and condescension. To them, she was the eccentric, sentimental widow of their founder's vision, a silent partner who was useful for her name, but had never interfered. Eleanor walked to the head of the table, placing not a folder, but a thick, heavy, 3-ring binder on the polished surface. The sound it made was like a gavel. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she began, her voice devoid of warmth. "I won't waste your time with pleasantries. You have, for the past 18 months, been the stewards of Julian Croft's legacy." She activated the large screen on the wall, and the video of last night's incident played in stark, high-definition silence. She had removed the audio. She wanted them to see the pure visuals, the swaggering maitre d', the shrieking patron, the terrified young waitress, the humiliation. When it finished, the room was still. Arthur Hemmings cleared his throat, a nervous, phlegmy sound. "Eleanor, a deeply unfortunate incident. Truly. But as you know, Dubois has been terminated. The matter is resolved." "The matter?" Eleanor's voice dropped to a dangerously quiet register. "You think Antoine Dubois was the disease? He was a symptom. The disease is here, in this room." She opened the binder. "This is a full operational audit. Staff turnover in the last year, 82%. Food costs, a chef's most controllable expense, are up 34% due to what the report calls systemic inventory mismanagement. But this," she turned a page, "is my favorite section. Human resources. Here are 47 distinct complaints filed by staff against Mr. Dubois, ranging from wage theft to sexual harassment. Complaints that were, by protocol, forwarded to you, Arthur." She slid a highlighted document across the table. Hemmings stared at his own signature on the dismissal form, marked "Action, none required." His face went the color of ash. "You have failed in your fiduciary duty," Eleanor stated, her gaze moving from one man to the next, pinning each of them in turn. "But more importantly, you have failed in your moral duty. You took a temple and turned it into a strip mall. So here are your options. Option 1. My fund acquires all of your shares at a 20% discount to yesterday's market valuation. You all tender your resignations, effective immediately, citing personal reasons. You walk away quietly. Option 2. You refuse. In which case, this binder is hand-delivered to the Department of Labor, the SEC, and a dear friend of mine at the New York Times, who has been looking for a story about corporate malfeasance in the hospitality industry. I will dismantle this board in the public square, bleed your reputations dry, and acquire your shares for pennies on the dollar in the ensuing bankruptcy. The choice, as they say, is yours." It was not a negotiation. It was an execution. By 5 o'clock, Eleanor Vance was the sole proprietor of Aurelia. The 6 months that followed were a quiet revolution. Eleanor did not rule from an office, she ruled from the floor. She was a constant, observant presence, her quiet scrutiny forcing everyone to elevate their standards. She replaced the executive chef with a brilliant young woman from Lyon, a protégé of Julian's own mentor, bringing the restaurant's culinary lineage full circle. Her primary focus, however, was Maya. The apprenticeship was relentless, a trial by fire. 1 week, Maya would be elbow-deep in fish guts at 4 a.m., learning from the new chef how to assess the quality of a scallop by the tension of its abductor muscle. The next, she would be sitting in on meetings with architects, discussing the acoustics of the dining room. Eleanor buried her in spreadsheets, teaching her to read the story told by numbers, to see the narrative in a profit and loss statement. "Anyone can learn to cook, Maya," Eleanor told her one evening as they sat in the empty kitchen, long after the last staff member had gone home. "Very few learn to see the whole ecosystem. A perfect dish is meaningless if the dishwasher who cleans the plate feels disrespected. The respect flows from the back office to the loading dock, to the prep station, to the pass, to the table, and then back again in the form of a guest's loyalty. It is a closed, sacred circle. The moment you break it, the magic is gone." Maya absorbed it all, her mind a thirsty sponge. She was transformed. The tentative girl was replaced by a quietly confident young woman, her movements assured, her questions sharp and insightful. She was not becoming Eleanor. She was becoming herself, fortified by Eleanor's wisdom. 1 year to the day after the Sterling incident, Eleanor sat alone at table 12. The restaurant was alive. It hummed with a different frequency now, a warmth, a genuine joy that was the antithesis of the brittle, anxious energy of before. The soul she had sought to reclaim had not just been restored, it had been reborn, stronger and more vibrant. A figure approached her table, moving with an easy grace. It was Maya. She wore a pristine white chef's jacket, the collar embroidered with the initials M.W. She was no longer an apprentice. She was the sous chef, the heart of the kitchen's creative engine. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her smile radiant. "Chef du Bois. The new or Chef du Bois," she added with a laugh, "sends her compliments. And a dish we're developing. We'd value your thoughts." She placed a small plate before Eleanor. On it sat a single, perfectly seared langoustine, nestled on a bed of ink-black risotto, dotted with vibrant green English peas, and a single translucent petal of lardo. It was a dish of breathtaking simplicity and profound complexity. It was Julian's philosophy on a plate. Eleanor picked up her fork. She took a bite. The sweetness of the langoustine, the earthy brine of the risotto, the pop of the peas, the melting richness of the lardo, it was a symphony. But more than that, it tasted of purpose. It tasted of respect. Her eyes closed. For a fleeting moment, she was not Eleanor Vance, the titan, the queen. She was just a woman in a restaurant, savoring a perfect bite of food, and it was the most profound luxury she had ever known. She opened her eyes and looked at the brilliant young woman standing before her. "He would have adored this, Maya," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely allowed herself. "He would have adored what you have become." "You showed me the path," Maya replied softly. Eleanor looked around the room, at Carlos explaining a wine's pairing with the passion of a poet, at David Chen greeting a young couple celebrating an anniversary with the same warmth he'd just shown a famous theatre director, at the harmonious dance of servers and bussers moving with shared purpose. Her work here was not done, she knew. A legacy was not a monument to be polished, but a garden to be tended. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt the ghost beside her smile. The kingdom was safe, the queen was home, and a new heir was ready to guard the flame. She raised her glass of water in a silent toast, not to the past, but to the endless, beautiful, and delicious future.